in Togo is around 46% of the population, and the share of the population that have access to clean cooking oil is very low, which is less than 10%. But when we consider the regional level in the country, we found that apart from the city, Lomé, in which the share of the population that have access to electricity exceeds 19%. The other regions have a low level of access to electricity. Like in the maritime region, only 20% of the population have access to electricity. And also in the north part, the southern region, only 11% of the population have access to electricity. So the access to electricity inside the country is very, very low. So what happened to the consumption and the composition of energy in Togo? The majority of the energy is consumed by the household, which accounts for 73% of the energy consumed. And then the current energy mix in Togo consists of 71% of biomass, 26% of electricity and of fuel, and only 3% of electricity. So the lack of access to clean and affordable energy impact negatively household well-being and the sectoral development of the country. For example, access to clean water, agricultural transformation, access to affordable means of transport. They are depending on energy availability. So, but specifically, when we took the agricultural sector, for example, we find that the agricultural sector employ around 60% of the active population in the country. And as we have seen in the previous picture, only 8% of the rural population have access to electricity. Due to this lack of access to energy in the rural area, the cultivate area is still using archaic equipment, and this area is around 89% of the cultivate area. They are still using archaic equipment such as hoe and cutlass. So there is no mechanization of the agricultural process. And the second thing we have noticed is that Togo mainly depend on energy imports to meet its industrial and residential power demand. Therefore, the households are exposed to different shocks, whether the shock can be internal or external shock. And then the last shock that the Togolese are facing now is the rising of the fuel price. So the lack of access to modern source of energy and any shock that limits energy access aggravates the energy poverty in country, in particular in the rural area. Based on this context, we have tried to raise some questions which can be our research question. The first question we have raised is how can we measure energy poverty in Togo, considering the context of Togo? How can we measure energy poverty and then vulnerability to energy poverty? And then among the poor population in the country, how many are deprivated in energy poverty? And then the last question we have tried to raise is how are these people distinctive, and what are the factors that affect household vulnerability to energy in Togo? So the objective of our research idea is to measure energy poverty and after measuring the energy poverty, we will try to determine the factors that contribute to energy poverty vulnerability in Togo. So for the variable measurement, energy poverty, we will consider energy poverty as our dependent variable for the last question we have asked. So in the literature, we have identified five measurements of energy poverty. The first one is the access to energy. So the access to energy is measured as a binary outcome. It means that we measure if somebody have access or have not access to electricity, or have access or have not access to clean cooking fuel. So the second one is measure in energy poverty through the lens of input. So this is measured by the energy consumed or the amount of income spent on energy. The third one is the outcome of energy poverty. So it's measured by the impact of consuming non-clean cooking fuel, or the impact of not having access to energy. So for example, for the health system, for example, we can measure energy poverty by the number of respiratory infection, or the number of child mortality at birth. The fourth indicator is the multi-tiers framework, which is developed by the World Bank. It's an improvement of the binary measurement of energy poverty, but the multi-tiers framework includes the quality of energy delivered. And then the last indicator is the composite index. So it combines different information about energy poverty in a single number, which can be an index we are going to calculate. But for instance, we haven't yet decided which measurement we are going to use for our research proposal. I'm still working on it. But for the last question I've asked, I've tried to identify some independent variables, which can include the location, the infrastructure availability, the area density, and household socio-economic and socio-demographic characteristics. For the data, I'm planning to use the harmonized survey on household living standard in Togo. But for the methodology, I haven't yet decided which methodology I'm going to use, and I'm still working on it. I hope your comment and suggestion will help me to find a good method, and also redefine my question to have a good paper. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dope. Are we okay? And okay, so Robert is next. He sent me an email saying something. Let's see. He shared the PowerPoint. Can I forward it to you, Natalie? And or who actually did this? What's your email? Thank you. Okay. And is Robert, are you online? Okay, yes, you're online. I can see you. Okay.
Hello, I problem.
Can we try tomorrow?
He was having connection problems.
Yeah.
He's in Congo, isn't he?
Yeah.
Okay. You've been there.
I've been there.
Doesn't matter. You gave him the flash drive. Did you get it back?
No.
Do we know sign language? Does everyone know sign language?
You want to try to get that there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we lose it.
Yeah.
Robert, can you hear us? You can try to share your presentation again.
Only that in Kinshasa.
Do you have to present?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, so today we were going to talk about how to write a good paper, and I'm going to talk about that, but I've never done that before, so I'm not sure I'll succeed. And anyway, what Professor Bautista has to talk about is much more interesting. So I'll try not to talk too much. It is. So so I made up some slides. But you sort of get the idea. The most important thing is an interesting question that people care about and they want to know the answer to, and a puzzle. I guess a puzzle is the word. It's hard to make progress on questions that economists have been thinking about since Adam Smith. You could say that's difficult. We made some progress because I guess you could say we were in the right place at the right time. So one of the reasons that paper was so successful is that we were in the right place at the right time, meaning we took these methodological tools that people who'd worked in this literature hadn't used, and we applied them for the first time. So, we used this instrumental variable regression that we've talked about in this class, but that was more or less the first time anyone had used that research design to look at that particular question of comparative economic development. So that was like a sort of arbitrage, taking some set of tools from one part of economics and importing them into a different part of economics. So when I say we're in the right place at the right time, it was kind of inevitable that would happen eventually, but we just did it first. And the second, so it's hard to make progress on on these old questions. So that might suggest, well, maybe you want to do something new. And I think what you see, like in a lot of the papers that we talked about, like this stuff about segmented lineage, all this stuff about kin society or age society, those are totally new questions in economics. Like no one talks about things like that. So that's nice because then you have a lot of space to do something original, but you also have to get people. You have to get people interested in it. Like I find in my personal experience, writing papers like that, people have this reaction that, oh, well, if that was important, why didn't somebody think about it before? Or like. That I would have thought about it if that was important. So like how you have to convince me that this thing is important, So and I would say, going back to dependent variables. Like if I thought about a lot of my research papers, they often come from reading the newspapers, you know, or just in the street, or, you know, like that's where I get a lot of inspiration from doing field work, or, you know, Professor Bautista and I are doing a lot of research in Colombia together about the organization of these paramilitary groups. And that came from just reading a newspaper article about these paramilitaries that built roads and schools. And these are like warlords, basically. Think of them as like warlords. You know, and that was like, wow, that sounds amazing. Like how did that happen? Or, you know, we wrote that paper with Rafael Santos about the impact of paramilitaries on elections in Colombia. It came from just Rafael sending me the article in La Silla Vacía. So like the inspiration comes from the real world, and you know, it comes from not the literature. You know, of course, in the end, you have to take it and you have to relate it to what people know. You have to put in literature so that people understand it. But I guess most of my personal research comes from thinking about, you know, the world and reading the newspaper and just kind of immersing myself in the world, you know. So there's some, I don't know if any of this is useful, okay? So then, you know, after you've found your dependent variable, you look for something it's correlated with, okay? So stuff is, you know, this is the hard thing about social science. Lots of things are correlated, you know. So in the 18th century, Montesquieu wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws. And in the book, Montesquieu discusses this correlation that was subsequently discovered by Jeffrey Sachs, which is that countries which are further from the equator, so here's just plotting latitude against GDP per capita, countries that are further from the equator, like Sweden and Norway and Canada and Finland, are richer than countries that are closer to the equator. So here's Kenya. Kenya's right on the regression line. You know.
Please,
So
audio,
we're on the
you
equator.
can't hear anything.
It turns out, you know,
Please look at the audio.
someone's to turn their microphone off. Oh, they can't hear. Okay, what can I do? Go back to this? Can you hear me if I use this?
It's not the microphone. I think it's something to do with the audio. Because I've heard you say.
Oh, I see. Okay, all right, okay. So what do we do now? I'll just keep talking, shall I? Yeah. So I don't know what else to do. I could tell a joke, but I'm not very good with jokes. I only know one joke. It's quite a good one, but and it's about economists actually. Who knew? Shall I tell a joke about economists? Okay. All right. So there's an economist, a lawyer, and a psychologist go to play golf, and they get to the golf club. And in front of them, there's the world's worst golfers they've ever seen in their life. They're like knocking the turf around, hitting the ball into the water, into the sand pit. They're putting, or it just, the economist says, oh, these people are absolutely, have no idea how to play golf. What are they doing in this golf club? It's a scandal. They should never have been admitted. And then they sit there and they're waving their hands saying, let us play through, we'll play through. And these people just completely ignore them. And then they get to the second hole. These people take 40, 50 shots to get the ball into the hole. They get to the second tee. Same thing happens. They get stuck behind these three terrible golfers. They're hitting the ball into the woods. They have to get more balls. And the psychologist is like, these people are just ridiculous. It's ruining my weekend. And they get stuck for 18 holes behind these people. They get into the clubhouse and they're in the bar. They start complaining about these people. And the barman says, oh, you mean those three people over there? And the lawyer says, that's them. Yes, that's them. They ruined our day. And the barman says, but they're blind. And the psychologist says, oh, no. What have we done? We were just so obnoxious. And I'm going to go over and offer them free psychological counseling. And the lawyer says, oh, gosh, this is terrible. We have to make amends. I'm going to go and offer them free legal services. And the economist said, why weren't they playing at night? It's the efficient allocation of scarce resources. Okay, that's my joke. All right, let's get back to Montesquieu. We lost Montesquieu. No. That would have been efficient, you see. Okay, so here, so here's the problem with asking a question like this, which is many things are correlated. Okay, so it turns out that countries further from the equator have higher GDP per capita. So you're interested in a classic problem in economic development, why are there rich countries and why are there poor countries? You're trying to come up with an explanatory variable. Remember the strategy, just one explanatory variable, okay, your explanatory variable. But which one to pick, I mean, after all, why not pick latitude, okay? So, that's what Jeffrey Sachs decided, that the real problem in Africa is that African countries are close to the equator and countries close to the equator are intrinsically poor. And, Jeffrey Sachs would show this figure or map, and yeah, they're correlated. But of course, that doesn't prove there's a causal relationship between them, okay? So we chose a different story, which was a measure of institutions, what we call institutions, or the security of property right. And that's also correlated with GDP per capita. So it turns out this is a measure of the security of property rights. That's also positively correlated with GDP per capita. So lots of things are correlated with GDP per capita. Why we chose, why did we choose the dependent variable we chose, okay? And I think, here's another example you could say of, like how difficult this problem is. This is from Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, it's a book I like because it's the first serious economics book I read when I was an undergraduate at the London School of Economics. And here's what Weber says. Montesquieu, in the Spirit of the Laws, says of the English that they had progressed the furthest in all things, in three important things: in piety, I don't think that's true anymore, by the way, in commerce, and in freedom. So, so Weber is quoting Montesquieu as saying the English were pious, they were good Christians, they were, commercially very successful, and they were also politically democratic, so they had good political institutions. And then, what Weber says is it not possible that their commercial superiority and their adaptation to free political institutions are connected in some way to that record of piety? So what Weber is basically Weber is making an argument which you would call like emitted variable. It's an emitted variable. He's saying, yeah, the English were commercially successful, and they had free political institutions, but they're both caused by an emitted variable, which is their record of piety. That's what Weber is saying. So that would be a sort of classic emitted variable bias story. You can show that democracy and income per capita are correlated, but Weber is saying, yeah, they're correlated, but they're both caused by something else, which is religion. All right. So I think why did we I say we sort of focused a lot on there's a dependent variable, there's an independent variable. Why did we choose the independent variable we did? I don't think that's just because of the way, particularly Acemoglu and I thought about this, that when we were students, we'd both read a book by Douglas North and Robert Thomas called The Rise of the Western World, which was a theory of this so-called great divergence. Why is it that if you go back 250 years, the difference in income per capita between the poorest and the richest country in the world was about 4 or 5 times, and now it's 100 times. So there's been this enormous increase in inequality in the world. And in North and Thomas's book, why does that happen? It's a story about the emergence of better economic institutions, in particular more secure property rights in Western Europe, which diffuses to some parts of the world, but not others. So I guess we'd read this book. It's a history book. I still use the first chapter of that book for teaching. It's a fantastic book if you've never read it. Really well written, fun, short. And so we both had in our minds this kind of institutional theory of this great divergence. So that's why when we started tackling this problem, we thought, okay, the right story has got to be institutional, okay? Of course, there's also good theoretical arguments for focusing on institutions. You know, when Sachs was talking about how Africa was intrinsically poor because it was in the tropics, there was no real mechanism. Like, what was the mechanisms? What were the theoretical mechanisms? It was completely vague. It's just a kind of correlation. But once you start talking about incentives and property rights, we all understand the theory. That's like one of the most basic kind of arguments in economics, okay? That we know prosperity comes from saving, accumulation, innovating, adopting better technology, and that happens, you know, when people are incentivized to do it. So there's both kind of like, I guess, empirical and, you know, we sort of convinced ourselves by reading a lot of historical stuff that this was the right way to think about things, and also, you know, there's a lot of good theoretical arguments. Of course, there's alternative hypotheses, and you can see in the paper we spend a lot of time talking about alternative hypotheses. You know, in particular, we go after this geographical thing that I was just making fun of, but we talk a little bit about culture and other things to the extent we're able to do that with the available data we had, okay? But again, the main focus of the paper is not all these other variables. You know, the main focus is on this one story, and, you know, other things may be important. You know, other things may be important, but the main thing is to convince the reader that your focus is the right one. Okay, but now I just showed you though that there's all these things correlated. So how do I solve this problem of causality? So a lot of the paper is focused on that, and we proposed a particular strategy, and I want to just talk a little bit about, you know, natural experiments, and then I'll try to explain how we came up with the strategy we came up. So if you think that's interesting. I wanted to, you know, we've been talking about natural experiments, but I haven't given you what's the best natural experiment ever, in my opinion, not by an economist, but by a medical doctor, which is by John Snow. Does anyone know who John Snow is? John Snow. Okay, so let me show you what John Snow did. John Snow was a medical doctor, and in 1854, he invented natural experiments. So in 1854, there was an outbreak of cholera in London. So this is Soho. This is his original map in Soho. And each black dot is somebody who got cholera, okay? So at the time, people had a completely incorrect theory of cholera. They thought that cholera was caused by these miasmas, which were like bad air given off by corpses, okay? So you can see here what's called what I'm indicating here, the pump. This is Broad Street in Soho in London, and the Broad Street pump. So Snow was convinced that the real reason people got cholera was because of this, you know, bacteria in the water, okay? And so he went around, like himself, like collecting information on all these people who died and got sick, and where did they get their water from, and he traced it to this pump on Broad Street here. But here's the problem. They're all clustered around the pump, you know, so he said, look, it's obvious they've all been taking water from the pump should be closed down, you know, and the reply was, no, you see, they're all breathing the same air. Like, they're all breathing the same air. Underneath, there's a cemetery from the Black Death, you know, which was the bubonic plague from the 14th century. These miasmas are being given off. You know what English people do, they drink beer. So the brewery, notice nobody died in the brewery, okay? So lots of people working in the brewery, nobody died. Why? Because they didn't drink water from the pump, they drank beer. And the beer, the water came from Derbyshire or somewhere, you know, special water to make beer, okay? But they were breathing the same air. So here's a natural experiment, you know, people were in the brewery, they were exposed to the air, but they didn't drink the water and they didn't get sick. Now, you know, the only problem could be is if a type of person who was particularly unlikely to get cholera happened to work in the brewing industry, you know. But that seems a kind of unlikely story. So he used this basically exogenous source of variation in the exposure to the water. You know, it just so happened you had beer, You drank beer, so you didn't use the pump, and you didn't get ill. Okay, but that's, you can't do this is an example where you couldn't, it's not ethical to actually do an experiment, right? So, but you had exogenous variation in people's exposure to the water, holding constant the miasma, okay? So he used this to shut the pump, basically. So I claim this is the world's first natural experiment. And if you go to, it's not the real pump was destroyed, but there's a replica. You can go here in Soho, and that's the John Snow pub in the background. If next time you're in London, you know, but like, I love this example because what is this? This is like empirical social science at its best, right? I mean, just like noticing the variation, figuring out that this was like amazingly significant, the fact that the people in the brewery, there's also a workhouse, you know, people in it's up here, the workhouse. People in the workhouse also, he interviewed people in the workhouse. Some people got sick in the workhouse, but it turned out that they were people who drank from the pump. The workhouse had its own pump. The people who drank from it's not so much fun to talk about as the brewery, you know. Okay, so there's a natural experiment. So you know, so that, and I like this, as I say, because it's so deeply empirical. I think this is, you know, this is great social science, and you know, and okay, so how did we get our idea? You know, so why did we take the approach we did? Well, back to the Great Divergence. So we know, you know, this is the story that we had in mind, Acemoglu and I, and Simon Johnson, that, you know, there's this divergence in the modern period. It comes because certain types of institutions get created, and, you know, the Industrial Revolution diffuses extremely unevenly around the world. You know, the lady from Togo was just talking about how 80% of, you know, in 80% of agriculture, they're still using archaic, you know, technologies. You know, let me give you an example of a technology which was invented in the Industrial Revolution in 1816 by John McAdam, tarmac unevenly distributed in the world, okay? So here's an idyllic Congolese driving scene. The roads are much better in Kenya than they are in Congo. And this was trying to get out of Kananga. You know, this is what the road's like. You know, this is the dry season. You can imagine what that's like when it's raining. It's totally impassable. So tarmac, you know, invented over 200 years ago during the Industrial Revolution in England, still hasn't diffused to Congo. And, you know, but I think the lady's example of Togolese agricultural technology might even be better, okay? So I give you a Congolese example because this, you'll see when you read the paper, when we start motivating it, we immediately start talking about the Congo. And, you know, and so why is it that stuff doesn't diffuse? You know, why is it that tarmac doesn't diffuse to Congo? Well, the institutional argument is there's a problem with incentives, okay? Large parts of the world, like the Congo, don't have institutions which encourage this. You know, in the case of the tarmac, they don't have, you know, the government, the political institutions don't encourage the politicians to spend the resources on public goods. But then you have to keep asking, you know, why, you know, why do they have these institutions, okay? And you need to think about a natural experiment in the variation of those institutions. Now, if you're thinking about the Congo, it doesn't take you long to come up with an explanation for why the Congolese have the institutions they do, and the word colonialism comes to mind. Okay, so when we were working on this and we started thinking about institutional variation in the world, and we started thinking about the differences between poor countries and rich countries and why they have different institutions, it quickly strikes you that a lot of these poor countries happen to have been colonies of European powers. Okay, so this is how we got onto that's how we kind of got onto the way of thinking that we did in the paper. Okay, so then we just started thinking, okay, right, so how do we think about that systematically? How do we think about the impact of colonialism? Colonialism is complicated, right? There's rich countries in the world, like US and Canada, that were colonies of European powers. So it's not just colonialism bad, absence of colonialism good. You know, there's a lot of variation within the colonial world. So we had to take that seriously. So we started reading history books about the history of European colonization and why European colonization took the form that it did in different parts of the world. And you immediately, historians have this idea of like a settler colony, Okay, that what distinguishes, and it's kind of obvious if you think about it, what distinguishes Australia and New Zealand and Canada and the US is that they're colonies of settlement. Like vast numbers of Europeans ended up migrating to those. And even in Africa, the country which had the most white settlement, you could say, which is South Africa, has the highest GDP per capita. Okay, so there's obviously something about these settler colonies and non-settler colonies. But we're trying to think about, the first stage, if you like. So we're thinking about how to model variation in institutions. That's where the action is. If you want to think about kind of establishing this causal relationship between economic institutions and development, you have to think about what creates variation in institutions, okay? And you have to tell a story. I've been emphasizing this, right? You need to, there's a rhetoric here of writing a paper, of like convincing people this is important and your explanation is the right one. So you'll see, there's a lot about that in the paper. So I'm just I'm embellishing a little bit, like I'm talking about our own train of thought when we wrote this paper 23 years ago, and how we came at it, and you can see there's a lot of history in the paper, and we spend a lot of time discussing this question, Okay, so the last slide, we read the historical literature, and the historians say, well, obviously there are these settler colonies. Okay, great. So now you can think of a source of variation. Number of Europeans. Like we can use the number of Europeans who migrated to different colonies as a source of variation in institutions. We thought about that. And then we thought, that's not going to work. It's not going to work because lots of Europeans came to the United States because they had better institutions. Why did they come to the United States and not Colombia? Because life was a lot better and there were far more opportunities in the United States. In fact, even if you look within the US at where, there's a very nice book by Hatton and Williamson about this. Why, where did Europeans, all these Italians and Germans and Swedes, and why did they go to Minnesota? Why didn't they go to Mississippi? Because in the North, wages were much higher, you could get access to land, you could vote. In the South, even poor white people couldn't vote, you couldn't get access to land, wages were lower. So the fact that so many Europeans went to the US and Canada or Australia or whatever is really an outcome of the institutions. So you can't use that, okay? You can't use that as a variable, all right? So there's a very important paper about development in the Americas by Stanley Engerman and Kenneth Sokolov, which, if you never read it, it's a fantastic paper. It's about like why North America and Canada diverged from Latin America. And it's full of ideas about that divergence. Their emphasis is very institutional, and they say, what explains why North America is more successful than Latin America is that two reasons. There were few indigenous people to exploit. So you couldn't base a society in the United States on exploiting indigenous people in the way you could in Colombia or Peru or Central America or South Africa or Zimbabwe. And second, you couldn't grow crops, except in the US South, which of course looks much more like a Latin American country. You couldn't grow crops which, like sugarcane and cotton, where you could use sort of slaves. Okay, so North America developed differentially because it wasn't a slave economy, primarily a slave economy, and you couldn't exploit indigenous people. So then we started thinking about, okay, great. So forget Europeans. Maybe another source of variation is historical density of indigenous people. Okay, so we talk a lot about this stuff in Why Nations Fail. If you have available, I discovered in Nairobi bookshops. Okay, so then we thought, like this is how we thought about it. So okay, great. So we're looking for a source of variation in institutions. We're looking for an instrument. What about historical density of indigenous people? Well, we actually used that in a subsequent paper, Reversal of Fortune. But at the time, we thought, no, we can't get away with that. Like, why is it that there's so many indigenous people in some parts of the Americas in 1492, for example? Maybe they're there because they're in places with more, which is better for agriculture, or there's more kind of underlying fundamentals which are consistent with high levels of productivity, and those underlying fundamentals might have a direct effect on income as well as on the construction of institutions, so that violates the exclusion restriction. You know, it's a bit like the discussion in Goldstein and Udry's paper that, you know, like that, you know, so we, I'm sorry, there's too many spelling mistakes here. So we gave up on that too. So I'm just telling you, like, this is how we went through all these ideas and we rejected them. And then, you know, we found the idea we used by reading another book by a historian called Alfred Crosby. So just like a lot of the inspiration, you know, for writing papers that I get comes from just learning stuff about the world and reading books by anthropologists or the newspaper or historians, ecological imperialism, Crosby tells the story of the Pilgrim Fathers. So the Pilgrim Fathers were these religious dissenters who ended up founding a colony in 1620 in Plymouth in Massachusetts. But actually they didn't originally want to go to Massachusetts. They thought about going to Latin America, to Guyana in the north of South America. And Sir Walter Raleigh, who was a famous British pirate, explorer, intellectual, politician, wrote a book about how Guyana was a paradise and we should be starting colonies. But the problem was the first colony that was started by English people, they all died of tropical diseases. So then the Pilgrim Fathers thought, we don't want to go to Guyana and die of tropical diseases. Let's go to Massachusetts. It's this kind of rocky, cold place, but at least there's no yellow fever and malaria. So then we thought, that's interesting. There's a source of variation in European settlement patterns, okay? And it's particularly appealing because, you know, it's a period before the discovery of, before modern medicine starts. So, you know, people, you know, you couldn't have public health measures when, you know, which might be endogenous to something else, when people had a completely incorrect theory of what was causing diseases, like, you know, the miasmas causing cholera that John Snow had to fight about, okay? And, you know, here you could sort of remind yourself that West Africa, in the colonial period, was known as the white man's graveyard, and we give lots of examples in the paper, because it was so unhealthy for English people. You know, Kwame Nkrumah once said in a speech, he never delivered on this, but he once said in a speech that he was going to build a statue of a mosquito in downtown Accra because the mosquito had saved Ghana from white people. So that was the sort of story we had in mind here. Okay, so that's what I'm just kind of describing here. I don't know if this is interesting or not, like intellectual history or whatever. Should I shut up? Yeah. Okay. So okay. Yeah, but they're too deferential, whereas you'll give me an honest opinion. Okay. So that's, you know, so that's what we did. So, you know, the question is well known. You know, even the answer is well known. I'm not recommending that, you know, as a research strategy. I'm just saying that's just happens to be the case here. You know, I'm much more interested personally in, you know, very creative lateral thinking. I tell PhD students that they should think laterally. Okay, but, you know, I must say that, you know, even though the answer was not being taken, the answer was well known, meaning these institutional differences, it wasn't taken very seriously at the time we wrote this paper. Like, you know, people were doing all this silly stuff like Jeffrey Sachs with his latitude and whatever, okay? So, and because the question is well known and the answer is well known, everything hangs on this identification strategy. And, you know, and in some sense here, I want to emphasize, you know, you need a theoretical argument, you know, for a source of variation or an identification strategy. You can't test the validity of an instrument. If you have multiple instruments, you can sort of do these over-identification tests, which I do in the paper, but they're very low power. They have very low power to reject a kind of false, you know, instrument. So you need an argument. You need, you know, just like the Kuba paper, we start with an argument as to why this is a plausible way of thinking about it. And, you know, and that's what we do. You know, you see in the paper, there's a lot of discussion of the history and colonialism, and we kind of sell people on this idea that colonialism is this huge source of variation. It's like, duh, you know, and so then, you know, but again, nobody was really talking about colonialism in economic development when we wrote that. Okay, so that's why, I don't want to go into this in great detail, but that's why there's a theory. You know, why do we have this theory? Well, because you need to make a theoretical argument as to something being a natural experiment or something being an instrument, because you can't test whether something's an instrument. You need a theoretical argument. So then we make this theoretical argument about basically how when the disease environment was very unattractive to Europeans, then you couldn't have a colony of settlement. So then, other things equal, holding constant population density or the type of kind of economic activities or whether there was natural resources. There's lots of other things, that created incentives to create what we call extractive institutions in the paper. Think about South Africa. When they discovered the gold mines, where they discovered the Kimberley pit, or they discovered the gold in the Rand, then suddenly there was a massive incentive to start exploiting Africans, because they needed to mobilize a labor force to start mining. So, of course, other things are going to be important in determining institutions, but we're just saying that this is one sort of source of variation, that when the disease environment was very unhealthy for Europeans, you didn't get much settlement, so there were not Europeans there who cared about the institutions, and you tended to get these extractive institutions kind of emerging, okay? So this is, the potential mortality of European settlements affects settlements. That affects, the past institutions. And then there's a sort of argument about persistence, that the past shapes the present, and then we can compare historical mortality of Europeans to current institutions. So I'm saying, the theoretical thing is important because it kind of builds the case for the empirical approach, and it builds the case for the identification strategy. Okay, and here's the first stage, if you like. Here's the data on settler mortality. Where did we get to? Then we came up with this idea reading Crosby, and we're like, great, okay, where the heck do you get historical data on that? And then Simon Johnson went to talk to this historical demographer. Non-economists know lots of interesting things. This historical demographer at MIT who knew about this work by Philip Curtin. So then we coded up Philip Curtin's data. Philip Curtin was a very distinguished historian of Africa. He wrote a fantastic book about the economic history of Senegambia and many other very interesting books on African history and African economic history in particular. And he constructed for the world this data set of historical mortality, mostly of military recruits. So not people dying in battles, but people dying of tropical diseases on various European military expeditions around the world. And that's kind of appealing because it's comparable. It's like young men of similar socioeconomic backgrounds. So, so there's some comparability. And what you find here is just, aggregating that to a country level, you find, consistent with the argument, places that were systematically more unhealthy for Europeans tend to have systematically worse economic institutions today. So this is this contemporary measure of security of property rights that we used, plotted against Curtin's historical measure of European mortality. All right, so that's the first stage in this, if you like. We're modeling the variation in institutions as a function of this historical settler mortality. And then the exclusion restriction is, this historical mortality of Europeans to these tropical diseases before the invention of modern medicine is not a source of variation in development outcomes today. First of all, as we discuss in the paper, the mortality of Europeans was completely off the chart compared to Africans, for example. So Mungo Park's second expedition down the Niger, every European died, but the Africans didn't die. The Africans had some immunity to malaria and tropical diseases. The English people had no immunity. Okay, so this is instrumental variables, but I just wanted to say, it's the same thing. Natural experiment, instrumental variables. You're looking for naturally occurring exogenous sources of variation. All right, and then this is a model. The model we use is something you've seen lots of times before. I just gave you the picture of the first stage where we regress current economic institutions on settled mortality, and then we use that the variation in current economic institutions kind of predicted by settler mortality in the second stage to estimate the causal effect of these current economic institutions on income per capita. Okay, notice that this is the only time in the entire 2 weeks we talk about some cross-country. It's very hard to do this cross-country analysis in a convincing way. So but there you are. And Ambrose is going to complain about how few data points we have in a minute. The strategy of the paper, I won't talk about it much more. So think about the way strategy of the paper is, there's one explanatory variable, there's one independent variable, there's one dependent variable. There's lots of other things that might matter, but they're not really treated terribly seriously. It's all about, making sure they don't confound. They don't confound the interpretation. They don't confound the causal variable that we're interested in, and that the relationship between these two variables of interest is robust to controlling for lots of things. So if you look at the paper, we start with something very simple. We start with almost like the bivariate correlation between GDP per capita and institutions, and then we develop the identification strategy, so that we show in a very parsimonious specification that this has a causal interpretation, and then we show that that's robust, basically. And as you go through the paper, you see all the tables. The main thing is just to keep your eye on the first row, which is the estimated coefficient on the estimated coefficient on security of property rights. And the focus is always on showing that that this coefficient is it doesn't matter what I control for, this coefficient is very stable and it's significant. Okay, so let me say a few things and then I'll be quiet. So here's the first stage. So we just do this it's like a bivariate regression. Okay, so we don't throw lots of, it's like very simple. Okay, and the R squared is 0.26 here. Okay, so that means there's 74% of the variation still out there, for your own favorite theory of institutional variation within the colonial world. So this is not the only explanation. There's lots of sources of variation. It's a source of variation with a particular property. Okay, that's the way to think about it. And then, so latitude, I told you latitude. Once we put latitude in there, then there's no correlation between latitude and institutions. Okay, and then there's robustness, continental dummies, just looking at variation, just using variation within continents, dropping these neo-Europes. So neo-Europes, what they call, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So you might be worried that everything is being driven by 4 countries. So we drop that, the coefficient goes down, but it's even more significant. And then we look at the second stage. Here's the second stage. And again, latitude, becomes insignificant. So one of the takeaways from the paper is that Jeffrey Sachs didn't understand the difference between correlation and causation. And in fact, the only reason that there's a correlation between latitude and income per capita in this sample is that it just so happens that Europeans created more extractive colonies in places close to the equator because they were so unhealthy for Europeans. So we kind of explain, one of the nicest things about the paper is we explain why Jeffrey Sachs found this correlation between latitude and GDP per capita, but we explain precisely why that does not indicate a causal relationship. Okay? And that's because of the way, there's a correlation between the colonial construction of institutions and latitude. That's the idea. Okay, and then blah, blah, blah. I don't really want to say anything else. What time is it? Yeah, and then we discuss, then we discuss a little bit some alternative hypotheses, particularly, we're mostly focused on this geography thing. We could say a little bit about culture. We look at religion. You could say culture is connected to, colonial, this is not a story about British good. That would be hard to get away with in Kenya, probably Uganda. British good, but some people like this idea that British colonization was good and Spanish colonization and Portuguese colonization was bad. And so we try to show there's no evidence for that, basically. That the idea here is that, English people were just as good at setting up extractive colonies as the Spanish people were. Look at what happened in Zimbabwe. That was all English people, expropriating the Africans' land and putting them into homelands. And, so that looks pretty much like Latin America to me. This is not to do with the British or the Spanish or whatever. It's to do with these particular contextual factors, about the disease environment, about whether or not there were indigenous people to exploit. The English people were just as good at exploiting indigenous people as anybody else. So that's the discussion about culture. Yeah. Yes.
Yep. Thank you so much. Just an inquiry. Would it be interesting to look at the colonial master? For example, we have the British. They had, I think, at one point there was German, then the British later.
Yeah.
And then you look at whether their coming affects the quality of institutions we have today. Is it possible?
So in the paper we look at whether there's a systematic relationship between the identity of the colonizer and, so for example, I even have the table here so I can show you the table. Okay, so for example, we look at so here's the first stage, for example. So we look at whether or not it was a British colony. So for example, imagine I look at British colonies compared to everything else, French colonies, German colonies, or whatever. Okay. So you find actually it's sort of interesting the result here, which is that other things equal, British colonies tend to have better economic institutions, but holding institutions constant, they have lower GDP per capita. So if you calculate the net effect, there's no systematic relationship between development and being colonized by the British, okay? But, so that's what we find in the paper. What you really need to do, of course, is to look in much more detail than this at the institutional organization of the colonies, So, if you just look, for example, at, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, they were all governed in completely different ways, even by the British. The colonial administration in Kenya was completely different from it was in Uganda, for example. So there's a lot of variation. Interesting. I don't know so much about German or French colonies, but I know within British colonies, there was an enormous amount of variation in how they were administered. So I think if you wanted to think about this question kind of more seriously than we were able to here, one should sort of try to get into the systematic differences in institutions within the colonies and try to understand their impact. So I actually have some work. I was going to talk about it in this class, but we didn't get to it. There's too many things to talk about, but I can send you the paper if you're interested in. There's an archive in London, which is Lord Hailey was a British colonial administrator who wrote this enormous book called African Survey in the 1930s, and there was a second edition in 1956. So when Hailey wrote that book, it turns out he sent out a survey to every British district officer in all of British Africa. And it's like a data set, basically, with all the structure of the institutions and information about taxes and government expenditure right down at this level of the so-called native authority or the native treasury. So we actually constructed for British colonies in Africa a very detailed picture of the organization of the native authority system, how they were organized, and they were organized enormously differently. Even Kenya, it's interesting because they're sort of uniform, but in Uganda it was very different. Like the north was organized differently from Buganda and the south. In Nigeria, there's huge differences depending on which part of the country you're in. So there's massive variation. So I would just say, that's a great question. We have a very simple answer here, but it lacks, there's a lot more nuance that needs to be looked at to kind of really get a convincing answer to that. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think this related to what Abros was asking, because there has been quite some discussion on, while we agree that there is no good colonization, no matter how you look at it, but when you try to compare then the effect of different colonizations. I don't know that that's how I should put it, as in when you look at those colonized by British, French, and so on and so forth, there has been some evidence that when you compare the countries that were colonized by the British and countries that were colonized by the French, those that were colonized by the British tend to have better institutions, tend to have, I don't know how to call it. And in fact, I had that discussion coming out much stronger when I worked in Djibouti for 1 year. And Djibouti was colonized by the French.
Yeah.
And that may also explain why you find a country like Rwanda, one of our East African countries, now moving from, trying to move away from the French culture and now introducing English and so on. I really don't want to, I don't know how to put it without appearing.
Yeah. So we don't find much evidence. We don't find much evidence for that claim here. But it's measured in a very crude, albeit measured in a very crude way. I guess my present focus also, like if you I wrote this paper 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. So I would say now, my problem, and one of the reasons I emphasize the 26%, as a source of variation in institutions, is that, this paper sort of attributes too much to colonialism and not enough to Africans' own institutional creativity or their ability to manage colonialism or construct different sorts of institutions. Like, if you thought about Rwanda and you thought about why was Rwanda doing so well, maybe something to do with adopting something to do with the British, but it's obviously much more to do with the Rwandans themselves and how the Rwandans built their own institutions historically and otherwise, right? I think that's pretty difficult to deny that that's not colonialism. Colonialism, may have messed up Rwanda in lots of ways, by kind of intensifying these distinctions between Hutus and Tutsis and by creating these kind of stereotypes and pressure, and conflicts. But fundamentally, it seems to me, the story of Rwandan success now is a story about, Rwandans building institutions and making them work, and it has little or nothing to do with colonialism. That's what we find here. I guess that's still my view. My view is that, the differences between French and English colonies don't look so large to me. There's a lot of variation, but I think, again, all of that just needs much better measurement than we do here. So, exploiting this variation within countries, there's massive variation. I don't know where similar information exists for French colonies, but maybe it's out there. Okay, so unless anyone has any, we talk about culture, but again, it's very inadequate, the discussion of culture, so I don't want to, we talk about religion and things like that, and what I want to emphasize here is just the strategy, why is this a successful paper? I think two reasons, we were in the right place at the right time. I can't promise that you'll be in the right place at the right time, but there was this element of intellectual arbitrage. I think that's not a bad strategy. You can sort of see that quite a lot of my research arbitrage is out of history or anthropology, or questions come from different social sciences, but you apply the tools of economists, to think about them. And that's appealing to economists. You have to sell them on the idea, but it's appealing. And then the paper is structured in this particular way that I've been talking about, to kind of get people, to hook people on the story and build the case. And then there's a particular strategy of looking at the dependent and the independent variable, and then, the way the tables are structured is very strategic. But you see now, most of the papers that we've been talking about have a similar kind of structure. That's the sort of style that people use to write these papers. So why don't we have tea? This is an old piece of research. And why don't we have tea, and then Professor Bautista is going to talk about some new and much more exciting research.
Should I start? No, wait, okay, wait.
You have to tell a joke.
No, I don't know joke. I just made a joke. I'm good at that, but I don't remember.
And I thought that was a serious remark.
Okay. Okay. So Professor Robinson just presented one of the most famous papers in economics. He gave you the intuition and how to construct the idea from the moment they got inspiration to the final outcome, right? But now what I'm going to do is messy, because I'm going to introduce to you some of the I don't know, it's like a research agenda, ideas. We're trying to come up with the best research question, but I guess at some point you don't find the proper research question until you have managed to put data together and have done several trips to and talk to people. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm explaining a process which is always messy. I think that research, you're always thinking that you know where to start, and when you go back to the field or you go and collect data, things are not exactly as you thought they were when you first drafted your proposal, and then you have to take some steps back and reformulate things. So I guess this is exactly the process we're going through, learning. And so, okay, so we started, I guess part of the motivation of this particular study was when I was teaching a class on women development and politics. And I could see how the way feminism defines itself is very different in the West than in the global South, right? There are different worldviews, and sometimes feminists in the global North want to impose certain views of how the amount of power women should have and the way power should be enforced is the way they defined it themselves. But what I learned with my colleague, Maliha Chishti, who is a feminist scholar, is that women have power in all kinds of ways in every single neighborhood, in every single household. And we just need to, I mean, there's obviously a lot of discrimination. Yes, we're not going to deny that. But I guess there's power in ways that if we only take the definitions of power and empowerment that is given by the Western scholars, we will tend to neglect a lot of power that women have in the global South under different conditions. So this is more or less what motivated me to start thinking, what are the areas of the world like where this actually has happened? And one of the best examples that we found was Nigeria. And this continues the conversation of what I was going to present yesterday on this paper by how political power allows for people who have that type of political power in Ghana to follow the land for longer periods, and they don't lose their property rights to access to land, and therefore that land is more productive. I guess Professor Robinson explained how perhaps they didn't look in detail into which were those traditional political institutions where women could have power. And this is why we started thinking, how is power of women in Africa? And why is it that at least economists don't seem to be wanting to study that? I mean, they study it only from this perspective of, let's create a dummy variable and see if the impact is different on men and women. But there are different, yes, I mean, that's a very reductionist view, but when you read the papers, it's more or less about the interpretation of the dummy of the gender. But there's so much more about being a woman than just that this is, I mean, and I think it's super important to try to investigate how do you get that power and why is it that no one has studied that type of power. So again, like the best example that we have is from the Aba Women's War that happened in 1929, when women got organized in different markets, in different cities or villages in Nigeria, especially in this area called Igboland. And they contested the power of the British to the point that structure that was imposed by the British colonial, the Warren chiefs, was basically rescinded, and they had to hire different anthropologists and different people who could go back and try to understand how is it that people in Nigeria organize, and why is it that those warren chiefs that they put on power didn't have any legitimacy to rule their people, and why is it that the women were so upset. But it also brought up this view of like, how come the women, how like women are super powerful, like how come we have neglected this power, and because they didn't bother on understanding which were the traditional roles of women in Igbo society. So this is a map that I bring to students in the US. I mean, there's Nigeria, and I guess the particular area that we're going to be talking about is Igbo land. And this is a Wikipedia map to give you a better sense of which are like the cities, like we're going to be talking about some of the cities. For example, we have two or three of the two professors that are online are teaching in University of Nsukka. Another big city is Enugu. Onitsha is also another big city in Igbo land. And Aba is where supposedly the riots started, but actually the wars started somewhere else, but they moved to Aba, and they got famous because a lot of women congregated in Aba, even though the frustration and the women market congregated initially in a different place. And this is the map done by a person who studied. Who is this map from? Like, okay, yes, I got confused with another lady who also. Okay, so this map shows how did the riots affected different areas in that part of Nigeria. So, for example, places where firing took place. I guess what the most striking things is European factories looted. So you see here these black rectangles. There are 3 areas at least where European factories were looted, attempted looted, native courts burned. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 native courts destroyed. There are lots of them as well, and native courts damaged. So I understand that this is all like violent events, and this is why it's called the Women's War. But I guess in dimensions that we don't want to imagine, violence is also power in a way, in a tragic way. So this map shows well the power of women in that dimension. Okay. So there's that, and there's also something called the dual sex political systems, the existence of having a woman and a man running or being the leaders of traditional political systems in Nigeria. And this is not that, so for example, the male king is called the Obi, and the female queen is Omu. And it's not that the queen is the mother of the Omu or is married to the king. She is a completely independent and separate person who gets appointed, or sometimes she doesn't get appointed. The way Omus, we learned during fieldwork, is discovered is by divination, for example. So it's not that when they are young and they, like, people decide that she's going to be the Omu. No, like someday, I guess the elders of the village decide that this person got a. I mean, we heard different stories on how this happens. Sometimes the woman has a connection with the water mommy spirit, and she announces it, and then the elders of the village acknowledge the presence of the spirit of the water, and this is how she is appointed the Omu of the village. But I guess what is important about this point is that in the west of Igbo land, it's very common to find political systems where there's a king and a queen, which is also a king, who is also a king. So she has this personality, and I'm going to give you an example of this. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is to show you a mix of what we found when we did field work and the conclusions that we got when we did field work, but also mixed with some of the literature that we have read, trying to make sense of what we found, right? Okay, so like in many areas of Africa, Igbo society doesn't have a centralized power, with the exception of the west area that I just described. So I guess this west area, it seems to have more centralized power than the rest of Igbo. But it's in general very decentralized, and there's a lot of variation on the type of traditional political institutions that you find in the different villages. And this and power is distributed in different type of institutions. So councils have certain power. Age grades are also, they get together and they make decisions. There are different societies and associations, male and female, like unions, or like the wives of the village. They also have certain power to come together and decide when to collect money for the hospital or for the school. And it's also given through lineages and secret societies. But the amount of power and the way they organize varies all around Igbo land, for example. So we visited a place called Leja, which is very close to Enugu. Like I said, it's very close to Nsukka, so it should be somewhere here, Leja. So I'm going to show you the picture. This is like more or less the center of the place. And this used to be a blacksmith town, so it has a lot of mystical power. Like if you ever have the chance to go to Nsukka University, make sure to go and visit Leja because it's beautiful, and it has, I don't know, it has a special charm. And they can explain to you how the spirit, there's a spirit who lives in a hut that is here, how the moon, I don't know, there were lots of, yes, I'm not going to digress, but what is important is that when there are meetings in the town, this is the space where the council meets, and this is where they make decisions. So how is it that this council is conformed? So Leja has 33 villages, and there's a council that has like the functions of the executive of the judicial tasks, for example. And it's composed by women and by men. Each of the lineage, each of the village sends a representative, a male representative, named the Oha, and the eldest of the Oha is named the Etse Leja. So we met with the Etse Leja last time we went there. But each village has kinships. And for the case of the women, each kinship names a woman, and it's sent to represent them in the council. So here, each kinship will name a daughter, and they are usually called aras. And the senior women of all of this group of women that are seated in the council is called Ese Dioma, who is always the daughter of the one village only, and it's only one kinship from one particular village who is going to be the leader of all the women who sit. But when you look at the level of representation, you end up with more women sitting in the council than men, which is also super interesting. So men sit on one side of the council, women on the other side, and when they have to make decisions, they all have conversations and they agree or disagree on different things. this is one of the shrines that we found in the market. So this is another aspect that is relevant for the research. Like traditionally, the power of women used to be in the market. They were the only, like the priestess or like women who had a particular position were the only ones who were allowed to open the markets in Igbo land. So this is a shrine. So you see, and what you find usually is like trees wrapped up with cloth, and you see the certain clay pots, and sometimes you see the different offerings that people do in these shrines. So that's one of the way in which you can think of power of women, right? The jury representation within their councils. And now I'm going to move to a very powerful book also that is written in the 1980s, trying to respond to, I guess, the way colonialism undermined the role of women in Africa, because the way they built their structures was basically by giving all the power to men without recognizing how women were warriors, successful merchants, queens, kings in the case of the west of Igbo land, and in general very powerful people as well. Once the British came, they didn't look into any of these traditional structures. So it's a beautiful book by Ifi Amadume, and the title is Male Daughters, Female Husbands, which also plays with the fact that in Igbo land, although she studies the case of Nobi, which is her village, which is the village that she knows very well and she grows up in, she highlights how men and women can have roles of men, and men can also have the roles of women in some instances. So male daughters comes from the fact that usually the first daughters, when they reach certain status within their communities, they can own property and they are allowed to make decisions or being involved in the different issues where men, that it's only allowed for main spaces in a way. And female husbands comes from the fact that whenever women show with their industriousness, which is a word that she uses a lot to describe how women can be economically independent and successful, they can also marry or marry other women and have within their compound different wives that will allow them to work as a team in the same way men in different cultures have different wives. So there's that also figure that she puts out there, which is not very recognized in the West, but she's saying like this is another way in which women can have power in Africa, and it's not well understood or studied in the West. So the village is organized around kinship groups, headed by the Okpala, which is the first son, and the Ara, first daughter. The most political role was the Agba Ekwe, who is the oldest woman in Ekwe society. And she is usually the priestess of the goddess, of the river goddess Idemili. And she is always going to be on top of the most powerful man, the Ese Agba, who was the senior man in the Oso title society. They also have two different spaces, according to Amadume. This is also part of what we have learned what we learned during field work. We visited Omu Obi Martha Dunku in Okpanam. So this is her Royal Majesty Obi, a picture of her. I think this is when she got her nomination as Omu. And this is her praying to the goddess Water Mommy. And like you see again, there's a tree that is sacred, there are different offerings, and there's a cloth wrapped up around the tree. And this is how she is recognized as a Neoma Man of the Year in 2014. So this represents very nicely the duality that Amadiume explains of how powerful women are actually observed as men as well, and have all the, I don't know how you say that, all the privileges that men have. Okay. And traditionally, it was the case that, so for example, she tells us this interesting fact. During colonial times, there were about 151 omus in that west part of Ibo land. At some point, this collapsed to only 5. Now she's working very hard to revive the institution of Omu, and she's trying to recruit some of them, and there are like 15 nowadays. And she explains that they have lost part of the power that they used to have because they were the ones that controlled the market. But now the different local governments have taken a lot of interest in controlling the market for the obvious reasons, because they can collect taxes, and that way they can control the economy of the villages. And obviously there's a lot of contestation with that. So if they cannot raise revenues to keep the ownership going, it's very hard to keep that institution going on. And I already mentioned this, that how is it that the Omu is chosen is by divination. And when we ask her, like, okay, but so how do you, because James wanted to say, oh, it should be wonderful if we can randomize where to get Omus in this place and not others. And I'm like, we're not going to do that. They should do whatever they want to do. Yes. No. And then he asked her, like, okay, so how can we help for Omus to thrive in again? And she's like, well, you don't groom an Omu. Like, this is a process that happens naturally and organically. It's not that you decide that this girl is going to become an Omu and then you name her. No, that's not how it works. It's a very different process that I'm sure we don't even understand how it happens. Okay. So these are examples of how is it that women are traditionally empowered. But then now we have to think, why is it that this is the case? So again, field work, and when you go through the literature that discusses this and are trying to highlight and rescue those examples of power, women and power in Africa, they have different explanations. So for example, pronouns are not gendered in Igbo. So there isn't such thing as him and her. It's like the person, and you refer to the person. I guess that's how it is. Also, and something that is super interesting is to see this connection of deities and the power of women. How is it that women transform or acquire power through deities? And what we learned also is that most deities in Igbo land are female. There's the goddess of the earth, the goddess of water, and a lot of the political power that women have comes from those deities. There's another important characteristic, which is that in general, women and men tend to have separate economic activities. Women control their own crops, cocoyams and cassava, and they own money and they control the market, or at least they used to. And Amadiume actually says the following: favorable matriarchal ideologies warranted an important position for women in the central political structure, the culture of glorified maternity. So there is another element of why is it that women are so powerful? When we also ask other friends, they also include this idea of maternity. like being a mother is a very strong element of the power of women. She does mention this, but I think she equally gives power to women through their industriousness, and she has a lot of examples of how there were lots of different women in Nobi who worked very hard and were like very curious and worked hard and acquired several wives, and that they managed to build an empire to the point that the husband was like, sometimes she tells that like sometimes even people didn't even remember the name of the husband because it was all about her basically. So for example, women grow cocoyams. This is the crop of cocoyam, and these are the crops of yams, which are sorry. Okay, so there's a mix of cassava and then there's yams. But yams are also sacred. So in different festivals, when it's like the yam festival, it's only men, the ones that come and roast the yam and are allowed to break the yam to give it away. And we, in the last trip that we did, we met Esenwanyi in Oguta. So she's this lady with a fascinating story. She's the priestess of Water Mami in Oguta, which is close to Onitsha, right? So the river is very important here because women also, that's another thing that we forgot to include. Women control the trade in all of this along the river. They were the ones that allowed for things to happen or not to happen, and I think that's still the case. And we actually have some Nigerian colleagues that tell that this could be an interesting thing and a hypothesis that they threw to us. They argue that women are actually more powerful along the river because they control the trade than women in like more to the inland area of Iboland. So that's an interesting hypothesis that one could try to test, for example. So this lady, the Ese Nwanyi, we met her, and she's like a traditional person. She's recognized as a priestess of the Water Mami goddess. That's her shrine. She was a very sweet, like calm, like a person that gives you peace when you meet her. She insisted that next time she'll cook soup for us. She told us her life story. This is where she does her, I guess, that's her shrine. That's where she practiced. And these are the pots that represent the different bodies of water around Oguta. And she showed us how she does her, I don't know how you say, I'm terrible at religious things. Like, she conducts her prayers, yes, and her rituals. And this is her, she can break cola. I don't know if you know of, only men are allowed to break cola, but if you are a very powerful woman, you are allowed to break cola. So she is one of the very few women who broke the cola and gave it away. And this is Uche, our colleague, and Chineru, our friend. Okay, so now I'm going, how much time do I have? Okay. Okay, I think with all of this, I'm showing how visiting places, talking to people, allows you to think. I mean, and this is the advantage that you have over us. That for us is field work, and we make it sound exotic to our colleagues. But this is normal life in the village. And this is something that you have right there. But we have to travel lots of kilometers and spend a lot of time and money to make this happen, and to go around and interview a lot of people to have a better understanding of these communities. But this is anywhere where you go in Africa, which is all to your advantage. So some of the Okay, and now I'm going to talk about the last way in which women can be empowered, which also came up while we were doing fieldwork. The, it's the organization called the Umoada. So in Igbo land, all the first daughters, as in the same way Ifi Amadiume argues, the first daughter in the different families is very important. So all the first daughters in a village, they get organized under an organization that is called the Umoada. And the Umoada are important for different things or procedures that happen in the village. One of the principal tasks that they have is that they have to bury like notable men and men in general, and they congregate when those men die. They are called, and I'm going to explain why they are called, and they congregate and they meet, and they are the ones that are in charge of the sort of ritual of burying that person. And sometimes these rituals can last for days, and there's a very interesting description of how this process happens, because the family of the dead person has to entertain the Umoada, otherwise the Umoada turns into a very nasty group of women who want food and who are not going to let the body rest until they decide to do so. So if everyone, they are so important that everyone needs to conform to what the Umoada is expecting. But that person cannot be buried until they don't decide to conduct the proper ritual. But we also heard a lot about how they solved a lot of disputes. And in a lot of, like for example, when the first time we went to Oguta, we asked, we interviewed the eldest man in the village, and he told us how sometimes he resolved disputes in plots of land, how someone had encroached into a plot of land that didn't belong to them, and people came to ask him, like, can you get rid of this person? And at the end, they solved sometimes problems, but then when we asked the Umoada group in the focus group that we had, and we asked them, like, what is it that the Umoada can do for the community? They said, like, we usually have the last word when it comes to land disputes. And I asked them, is your word more powerful than the one of the eldest person in Oguta? And they said yes. Usually people take more seriously our word against the eldest person in the village, against the eldest man in the village. So that shows how powerful they are. But now, okay, so this is another quote by Amadiume: the power and authority of daughters were the result of a cultural construct, not of economic achievement. So I guess the power that they have doesn't have anything to do with how wealthy they are, but it's because of that important role that the first daughters have within Igbo society, which is something that no one studies or no one seems to focus on. Okay. And I guess what is also important about that quote is that this sharply deviates from how women acquire power in Western societies, right? We are told several times that the only way that women can achieve empowerment is by giving them a cow, like what Lydia was explaining. Let's give women cows and chickens. Let's conditional cash transfers. They are always given to women. Why? Because they think they are the ones who are more responsible and the ones that should be looking after the children. But at the same time, you're reinforcing that stereotype that women are the ones who have to do those tasks and free men from those responsibilities of having to look after the children and doing household chores. Okay, so these are the Umuada in action. So this is from a famous, also, uh, Jan Balcel, is she an anthropologist? She's an anthropologist who have studied in great detail the water mommy spirit in Oguta. She spent several years there. There's a documentary that we're due to watch, so we should watch it soon. And she shows how there was some, in that particular picture shows the women being upset and going to protest in the village square because there was some complaint about a dead person being killed by someone, and they were furious about the verdict that the eldest produced. So they are getting their sticks and they are about to go and complain and curse, yes, which is, yes. And that's one of the things that we heard, like, you don't want to be cursed. Like, only women can curse. Men cannot. Only women can curse. So again, those are different sources of how women are powerful in Igbo land. Okay, now here's the difficult task. What are the research questions in this research that we're trying to put together? And I guess this is like the most boring way of framing the questions. I'm sure that once we collect more data and we do a little bit more of field work and have a better understanding of Igbo society, maybe something more exciting will come up. But I guess a very natural research question is like, how is it that these different types of empowerment, the jure political power, traditional political power, and de facto traditional power, empower women when you measure it with the DHS indicators, like like how independent are they when they make decisions? How many assets do they have? So there's one of the research questions, and how do these sources of power interact with the political power of women by a modern state institution? So another interesting question is whether the power that these women have in traditional political institutions also translate into, for example, what Cecilia is interested in studying. Do they get more seats in parliaments or the different political modern institutions because they have always been recognized at the traditional level, and does that allow them to have better recognition when it comes to modern political institutions? That could be another research question, but again, I would like to listen to your ideas if you think there's a way of improving this or making it more exciting. Okay, and there are different, so when you're trying to persuade economists that this is interesting, you have to think of hypotheses. So which could be different hypotheses that could allow us to test the link between women's empowerment measured in different ways and the strength of this de facto and de jure traditional political power of women. So the first one is that when we look at de facto power, like when they act collectively, that we can think of three different factors that would facilitate the fact that women are gathering and can act collectively in better ways in general. So the first one is settlement patterns, how close the villages are to each other. And the hypothesis is that the closer these villages are, the easier it is for them to coordinate. And the reason is that, or this combined with the fact that when the daughters, there's an exogamy rule in some of these villages, not in all of them, but in some of them. So when the first daughter or the daughters of the village marry, they have to marry to a neighboring village. They cannot marry a person from the same village. Sometimes this rule applies only to kinship. so and there's an endogamy rule. Sometimes this is allowed, but there is variation on that, and there is no systematic account of which village allows for this to happen and which doesn't. So I guess one of the things that, and I'm going to explain how. So we are recognizing that there are lots of variation in the different traditional political institutions, and I told, when we were discussing what are the ideas, what is it that we're going to do, I told James, like, look, just gathering data and understanding, having a sample of how these traditional powers work is, for me, is fascinating. Like, if we could try to make a map of how all of this works and try to create a map of who has what and how does it work, for me, it would be fascinating. But obviously, a more ambitious goal is to try to test hypotheses about this. So, again, one of the first hypotheses that we could think of is that the more frequent the gatherings of the Umuada, the greater the participation, and therefore the more likelihood of achieving different goals. So like I said, it is possible to have the Umuada providing public goods to the village. They can come together and decide that this person is going through a difficult moment. Let's collect money or help this sister out or this daughter out because she's going through a difficult moment. Or let's collect funds to construct the school. Or let's resolve that conflict that our neighbor brought up to us. But if they are close, they can gather in a more easier way, and they can achieve more goals in that way. There's also variation in the patterns of exogamy and endogamy, like I said. And the other hypothesis that we can throw out there is that when there is village endogamy, it would be easier for the Umuada to come together more often and to be more vibrant, because for that reason, because it will be easier for the daughters to assemble. Now, the Umuada also meets when they bury men, right, in their natal village. So a good idea for an instrument, for example, is to try to capture, like collect data on the number of burials that happened in the last so-and-so years and how often this happened. Because the more frequent these deaths happen, not that I'm wishing anyone anything, but the more frequent you have these events, the more likely the Umuada will meet. And one could expect that they are more cohesive. Yes. Yes.
So this train of thought is very similar to the train of thought we're trying to find. I described how when we were working on that project, we started thinking through sources of variation. What created variation in the construction of institutions in the colonial period? Was it, the European settlers, the fraction of the population of European descent? Was it the historical density of indigenous people? So this is, I just wanted to sort of point out that Professor Bautista is sort of describing a whole bunch of ideas about these sources of variation in the same way that I talked about these sources of variation this morning, and trying to figure out which one is the most convincing source of variation to exploit in understanding the consequences of the Umuada. Sorry.
No, that's good. Yes, I agree. So, male burials seem to be a natural way of trying to instrument the power of the Umuada, for example, because the number of male burials that happened in the village will influence only the empowerment of women via the facto power that they have. While you don't expect that number of burials will affect how empowered they are in other dimensions. It's hard to, I guess, I'm sure people will find reasons on how that's not completely exogenous, but yes. Yeah. Yeah. This is a good idea. And now, how to make hypotheses or how to try to exploit the variation on the jury power. So, like I said, we in the west of Iboland, we observed that as a response to a more centralized political power of men, women reacted and they formed their own centralized political power. And it seems to be the case that the closer you are to Benin, this happened in a stronger way, because I guess the hypothesis would be that the closer you, so what we know about the history of Iboland is that they are all migrants of the kingdom of Benin. But the closer you are, obviously, the more entrenched the characteristics of how the state worked is present, right? So you're more likely to replicate the same centralized political institutions. While the further you are, those type of institutions get more diffused and mixed with other type of institutions that could have been there by people who inhabited Iboland in the east. So I guess here the hypothesis is that where we can use distance to Benin from where the migrants came as a source of variation in the de jure political power. So thinking that I guess you will end up with a more centralized political structure, a more de jure centralized political structure the closer you are to Benin than the further you are. So you won't find the institution of the Omu everywhere, although you will find the Umuada everywhere. So that's the variation we would like to exploit there. And I'm going to illustrate this in the regression that we are thinking. I mean, that if hypothetically, if we had the data, this is the way we're thinking about, but again, we might change our minds and decide that there's something else out there. Okay, so what could be the possible steps to follow? Yeah, this is where it gets, but I mean, the other thing that I'm not discussing here, but we are starting to discuss, is to do the women's war, like to overlap a map of the villages underneath the boundary of the women's war, and to look at villages inside the boundary and compare them to villages outside the boundary. And maybe with the DHS data that is also geocoded and has data on women's empowerment, you could try to see if there's a significant difference between having been inside that boundary and outside that boundary on how empowered women are. Or maybe trying to collect women representatives in whether they get elected with more likelihood within that neighborhood or not. Because we know that, I guess we need to find out what stopped women to spread everywhere else. Yes.
After the Women's War, the British set up a commission of inquiry, and there's a 400-page report where they interviewed many women and other people who participated in the riot, and that's constructed from all the incidents that were measured in this report. But think about Mau Mau, or think about many. There must be very similar, must be incredibly rich information about incidents during Mau Mau in Kenya. Where did that happen? Like you see a map like that, you think regression discontinuity.
And that's a non-so-expensive research strategy.
Not at all. You just get the 400-page report and you just create a data set, and it didn't cost you anything.
and you mix it with the DHS data trying to see if there's any correlation with anything. Again, this is work in progress. This is something that we are starting to code and collect, among other ideas that, I mean, okay. So now it comes expensive because now we're thinking about, let's collect data, and we would like to have, so during August we're going to try to put together a pilot, going to at least 10, 12 villages, try to ask about traditional political institutions where women have power. But Professor Robinson, I mean, it's like we want to put a survey that will ask about everything. So he's interested in warren chiefs, for example, and Daniel is interested in religion. So we're going to put different models. You want to talk? Okay. Do you want to say anything? So far, like, the idea would be to try to gather as much information about the power of women from the facto perspective and the juror perspective. And the idea is to get to the villages and interview the different S's, or the elders of the major lineages, or people who are notable. Sometimes these S's have collaborators around them that are in charge of keeping like the oral history or the traditions in these villages, and they explain to you how all the different processes take place and why this is important. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, and Moses suggested a hypothesis we hadn't thought about before, which is that the slave trade in this part of Nigeria was run by these people called the Aro people, who are from Aro Chukwu. And so they're still very distinct. Everybody knows who the Aro people are. They tend to have their own kind of autonomous communities outside other villages. So one hypothesis actually is if we collect information on trust, Aro people who actually ran the slave trade, for example, they may be much more trusting than other people, because like your point was, well, but you need a lot of trust to run business, and the slavery was a business. But in this context, we actually know who ran the business. So we can actually try to look empirically at whether there's differences in trust between Aro people and other Igbo people. So that's another thing.
Yeah. Then we would like to connect with the leaders of the Umuada or members of the Umuada to ask them how many times do they meet, what's the preferred way of communicating, how many burials did they assisted to in the last 5 years, what are their main purposes of gathering together, do they collect money to achieve X, how many disputes did they solve. And we also want to interview random 5 men and women in the village to have more power and other different perspectives about the functioning of the village, and socioeconomic outcomes that we obviously consider important. Okay. So what is the type of data we would like to collect? I started describing it. So to measure the power of the Umuada, I already told this. How do they transmit their cultural practices? What are the public good provisions they are engaged in? The importance of burials. We also want to learn about settlement patterns, whether the village practices exogamy or endogamy in terms of marriage, all kinds of political institutions, and try to have a better understanding of how are the leaders elected or appointed, from which, like, what's the process behind it, what decisions they make. I mean, anything you can think of. We're in the process of building the questionnaire and trying to put together what we think is relevant. Obviously, so these are for the independent variables. So when it comes to the dependent variable, levels of female empowerment, obviously we would like to collect economic autonomy of women. Like I said, women plant cocoa yams and cassava, men plant yams, and whether they keep control of the market or if that's not the case anymore. We also want to collect data on this relationship between deities and women. So we want to collect the number of data on the number of shrines that are there in the village, if that's possible, because at some point there are villages that don't have any shrine whatsoever, while there are villages that there's a shrine in every three trees, more or less. You find shrines very often. I guess proximity to the lakes and to bodies of water is also important. And finally, so this is the another regression, and yes, exactly. So, I mean, again, maybe none of these things happens and things change, but this is like something that we are, like if we had to put it in a regression form, this is how it looks at the moment. So the econometric model would be well, we have the outcome, which is empowerment outcome of interest of individual I guess in this case is women in village V. F is a measure of the de facto power of women in village V, and J is a measure of the jure power of women in village V, given by the information we collect in the survey and other important factors that we might want to include in each of these. And now, how do we think about the variation of the jure and the power and the jure power? So there are two first stages. So the facto power will be conditional on B, which is the number of male burials normalized by village population in the previous 5 years, and D, which is basically the variable that will determine the amount of the jure power is distance to Benin City. And the idea is that neither male burials or the distance to Benin will be determinants of women empowerment nowadays, and that the only way they can affect these two powers is by affecting de facto and de jure traditional political power. Okay, so those are the ideas that we have, and I guess we don't have time to discuss your reactions.
I think it's a nice, that's how, this is how we think about research, I guess, like all the way from the beginning, just looking at the world and just learning about the world and being kind of amazed at the world, and then going all the way through, and then you have the instrumental variable regression, which there's no commitment to, but it's a nice, we haven't got any data, and she hasn't run any regressions, but I think it's a, that's how we think about research, and I guess that's what we're here to talk about. Yeah, it's a great example of that.
Okay,
Yeah.
reactions or comments? No, don't say that. If you don't want to say anything, that's fine. Or you can think about it very deeply tonight and come back tomorrow. Huh? What? Clapping. Cecilia.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very interesting study, given that I think all along we've been told women have, they're underrepresented. They somehow, because of our culture, they seem not to have power. But thinking about it, even in the Kenyan situation, I think it's true women do have a lot of power traditionally. It's just that this power has been either forgotten or masked, or it's just been somehow we can't see it. Maybe because of that reason of colonialism, maybe there's just a way it was masked. And also, like the way you've spoken about the woman giving, praying to the goddess, like she's more connected to the deity than the men. And I heard Moses saying uchawi, which means witchcraft in Kenya. Maybe it's also that notion of if you are seen as a powerful woman, you're also seen as a witch. You see now, that's already a discrimination that maybe also limits women power, because that's where the power of women was. It was more spiritual maybe. So I think it's a very interesting paper, and it's really going to bring out, maybe as Africans, women, we have forgotten what our power was. So maybe. Thank you.
of course, I had to reply. But jokes aside, really, the question is whether we would talk about contextual generalization, and actually largely supporting what Cecilia is saying, because, for instance, what is considered in this particular study as power, in our place, it will be a very serious, a very serious negative connotation on the part of the woman that actually this is not, it is power, yes, and it's spiritual power, evil spiritual power. And therefore, if you come from some communities like Kisi, and that can be, you can do a simple search online and find if there is even suspicion that this woman, it's not just limited to women, just in this particular context. If one is suspected to be consulting those powers, and especially now if there is even evidence that you have a shrine that you go to consult and pray, and that is sufficient evidence to earn you a death sentence. So whereas in certain setups it may be considered as power, in this place it is being taken very negatively, and no, it is not going to be allowed to live. So I'm not so sure now, and that is what maybe I wanted to ask, whether we can talk about generalizing that context to say that that is power, and we bring it here to say also this is power, and I'm not in any way trying to denote that study in a negative context. It's trying to look at the two contexts, and whether the context in Nigeria would be generalized across communities, even in Africa itself, and what the results of those studies, for instance, would mean for power as understood in most of these other jurisdictions. Thank you. But broadly, it's really presents a very interesting, I mean, a source of intellectual curiosity, and really the way the methodology has been developed, quite interesting how you have come about it, how you have tried to operationalize power of women, really quite interesting, I would say so. But now as to what the implications of the results of the study would be when applied in different contexts, perhaps you may want to think about it. Thank you.
I think you're right. And I think people can push back even within Nigeria, because I guess Christianity has expanded and then there's a reaction. Like when I asked, we asked the Omu, are you a Christian? And she says like, yes, of course I'm a Christian. But for us, obviously for me, I grew up as a Catholic. I have no religious studies or anything. For me, it was a contradiction to see how she was praying to the water goddess, and at the same time she was claiming to be a Christian. Because I guess I've been socialized into thinking that the only God that you pray to is baby Jesus and God and, and that Christian God. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that even within Nigeria, you see variation in how people have incorporated Christianity in their lives. And I guess there's more resistance in some areas than in others. But I guess that's also an interesting question. Why is it that in villages, as like in Leja, you observe a lot of shrines and African traditional religious practices than in the village of our friend, where the big majority are all Christians? Like, why is it that you observe that variation? That's also a very natural research question. So I guess it's more or less the same. Like, why is it that in Kenya, traditional African practices can be seen in that negative way, while not? And so
I think like in eastern Nigeria, so I think there's a huge variation in my personal experience within Africa in terms of how people think about these supernatural forces and whether they're good or bad. And I think in some places there's a lot of focus on they're bad. in eastern Nigeria, people don't really talk about witchcraft. You know, they talk about manipulation of these supernatural forces, but it's mostly for good things. You know, it's for getting on in life, or it's being successful, or there's not so much this malevolent use of witchcraft for making people ill or whatever, you know. In Congo, you have both. You have both positive and negative. You know, you have politicians, for example. You can't be a chief in Congo if you don't have strong supernatural authority, because everyone thinks you can't get anything done without that. But at the same time, everyone recognizes that supernatural power can be used for kind of malevolent purposes also. So there's like a public constructive use of supernatural power, and there's a malevolent private use of supernatural power. I don't know anything about how that is in Kenya. So, and I think that varies a lot, you know, in different parts of Africa. But I don't really understand why it is. But in eastern Nigeria, it's very much the focus of, they don't talk about witches in the same way people talk about witches in Congo, or the way you were just talking about witches amongst the Kisi, or people being suspected of witches. Do they? They don't talk about that. It's very much sort of, it's more like Pentecostalism. It's sort of like, you know, the prosperity gospel or something, you know, like it's like that lady, for example, Ezenwanyi in Oguta, praying to her, you know, making sacrifices and rituals. You know, what is she doing? People come to her, and she mediates between these different deities, these water goddesses, and Chukwu. So Chukwu was like the you know, there's like one god, you know, the Igbo have one god, Chukwu. But there are many deities, and the deities are ways really of approaching Chukwu and asking for favors, asking to interpret what's going on in your life or misfortune. Like people come to her shrine, and then she intermediates between the water goddesses and Chukwu and tries to interpret their problems, and right? I mean, you know, so I think that it's not like witchcraft. It's supernatural power, but it's not used for kind of malevolent. Why? I don't know. Like, you know, I don't know, but it's too difficult to ignore. And like one thing we noticed, you know, as Professor Bautista was saying, is like there's a striking correlation between places where women are more powerful. There's much more kind of supernatural activity, you know, should I say, shrines or whatever. Like that is there. It's a correlation. And so how to understand that? I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. It's something that I've been grappling with, looking at the papers that we have reviewed for the last 2 weeks or so. You see, I come from a policy environment, and I've been struggling to see what are the policy relevance of this kind of studies, because most of them seem to be exploratory, just to find out how things are, or what are the issues. But now at the end, I'm wondering what kind of policy recommendations do we derive from these papers, and can we generalize those findings given the kind of setup where these studies are done, the unique nature, like that issue of the unique nature of the study areas. Is it something that can be applied elsewhere or generalized to an extent that it can be useful to another setup or another jurisdiction? Yeah, so those issue of policy relevance and generalizability of these studies, because even for ARC, when you are sending your proposal, they are always very keen on seeing what are what is the policy relevance of the study you are undertaking. Yeah, so that's what I've been struggling with.
Yeah, I think if you think about the Moscona and Sec paper, that had interesting, looking at the difference between these kin and age-based societies, that actually had important policy implications, because it shows that the incidence of these different policies are very different, you know, depending on how the society is organized. You know, I guess, you know, my feeling is that, you know, I guess, you know, I'm much more interested in these big social science questions about Africa, about the world, about, you know, using African experience and understanding African society and African development. And, you know, if that leads to a policy conclusion, then that's great. And if it doesn't, but it helps me understand the world better, then I'm happy, you know. So I think, you know, I think that, like from my perspective, going to conferences in the United States and whatever it is, and there are too few Africans. There's too few African scholars. There's too few African intellectuals. We need more Africans talking about Africa's problems. You know, you're the people who understand this continent, not a bunch of American academics, you know. And so you know, so I'm all in favor of policy conclusions if you find them, but I guess my own personal agenda is a much more intellectual agenda. You know, what needs to change is, you know, we need more African intellectuals setting the agenda on these topics, and I guess that, you know, that should be obvious from the way I talk about stuff. But not to say if one can draw a policy conclusion, like in the Moscona and Sec paper, then that's fantastic, you know. But you know. And you know, here's a policy conclusion, okay? Why is it that the World Bank is so totally and utterly ineffectual? Because it does not understand African society. You know, if you look at every community-driven development project which is evaluated in Africa, in Sierra Leone, in Congo, wherever it is, it's always found to be completely irrelevant. Why is that? Because nobody bothers studying African society or understanding who they're dealing with, you know, or understanding how African society is organized. They come with some, you know, one-size-fits-all intervention and plonks it. So there's a good reason for studying Africa, which is policy relevant. Yeah. Sorry. Now you got me going, Alex.
I actually consider the studies really quite relevant. I entirely agree with you, because really if you don't understand the beneficiaries of your intervention or intended intervention, then really you tend to bring solutions that don't apply. And even when you have, for instance, the approach used by World Bank to bring a standard questionnaire that is used in most of these studies, then you realize that even most of the questions being asked are really not relevant to that particular community. And even, I think in the course of this, the training, over tea time, we had some discussion there. I mean, the question being asked was really when they say that, you know, in Africa they are poor because they live on less than $1 per day. And we try to look at our own relatives back home, asking ourselves whether they are actually poor, for reasons that they live on less than whether $1 or $2 a day. Because this person has his own land, never pays rent, never pays rent. In fact, he can stay for a whole, even 2 weeks without cash. So because you want to take breakfast, you go to the garden there, dig potatoes or arrowroots or whatever. You have a cow there, you milk, you get your milk, and you don't even need to take milk because you can take porridge. So, so when you look at all these things, then you conclude that, and these people have no credit card, they have no bills to pay. Yes, they have no electricity, but they are not complaining. So I entirely agree with your studies, because you want to go to the ground and get the facts on the ground. Then if you really have to make a decision, whatever it is, even when you say, for instance, like you are doing studies on women and power and so on. So if you really say that you want to have a program to empower women in Nigeria, how will that apply if you don't understand power of women as understood in Nigeria? Really, that would be my thinking. And I find the standards are largely disruptive, I would say, on a positive note. Disruptive to the sense that they tend to disrupt our existing understanding of studies and the methodologies and so on, but also introducing new areas of interest as well. Thank you.
I think we take the point that Kenya is not like Eastern Nigeria. You know, in fact, Western Nigeria is not like Eastern Nigeria, and Northern Nigeria is not like Western or Eastern Nigeria. You know, like, what is this expression? Africa is not a country. You know, like, Africa is just incredibly diverse and heterogeneous, and so, yes. Yes. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why it's so fascinating to study Africa also, that incredible diversity.
Okay.
First of all, thank you, Moses, for a very nice explanation, like your human mind. But then, it's not a question. Thank you, Prof, for that is a very, very, a nice kind of topic you're looking at. So to me, when I was listening, there is something, I had questions now on my mind. So I was thinking, the Umuada, you're saying this group of female, they meet for male burials. Who bury the females? So there could be something there. Yeah, there could be something to find out there. So some power relation, why men, and okay, who buries the female? Why not them, meet after? So there could be something there to really dig and find out.
Just related to that, though, that's not. Okay, just related to that, though not what I really wanted to comment on. There's somewhere you said that when they become, is it a queen? It's like they are a man. Then I was asking also, like the way she is, I was thinking loud. Then if you're a man, do you get married or do you marry or what?
No, so that's one of the difficulties. So that is why a part of the reason why it is so difficult to have more omus present, because once you decide you want to become an omu, you have to go like separate from the partner that you have or never marry and live independently in your house with a shrine. So the omu that we visited is wealthy enough because she was a very entrepreneurial, very successfully entrepreneurial lady in the US, and she has an office and the house and lots of parking lots. She made a lot of emphasis on the number of and in her palace there's a lot of parking lots for all the cars. But she was saying it's very hard to get women to become a nomu because they have to live on their own or with the people that conform her community without the husband. One omu that we met had to move from her family, husband, children environment to go back and live with her parents. I wouldn't do that. And so those are like big sacrifices, and they have to learn how to run the to collect the taxes from the market, and they have to commit spiritually to the water goddess. So there are all these requirements that make it super hard and special, and that's why lots of women are saying no, thank you, even if they have a particular intervention by special powers to become omus, or the elders of the village decide you can become an omu or not.
So it looks like a woman has to work very hard to become a man in that.
I don't think women want to become men. I think that's the thing. Like the feminism in the 1980s, like women have to be like men. I don't think that's the case anymore. Women have to be women, and we are happy to be women, but we just want the same opportunities, and we want to have the same. I don't know. We want to have this. That's up to them to decide. Yes.
So initially I was just thinking of the traditional practice in Nigeria, the way women do it and the way they are so powerful in their traditional ways. And I was connecting it to our country, Kenya, whereby when as much as, modernity and Christianity have overtaken the traditional ways, you realize that especially for religion, the church and all those activities that relate to religion,
mostly it is done by women. If you go to a church of around, let's say 1,000, like 800 would be women. So I was just thinking loudly, how would you connect the religion now in Kenya and that? And also some of, activities that are done by women, especially in the villages. Women are really participating in some economic activities that they even become more powerful than men, though basically they are not, they are not recognized as powerful in the communities. So that's how I was thinking about it according to our country.
They just want to give in a very altruistic way to all these people who are going through all of these difficult moments. So I guess, fine. I mean, for her, that's powerful and it's very meaningful because it gives purpose and life to all of these people. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are different understandings of that power that women have. But it's also a fact that women seem to work better collectively, or like when it comes to doing something communal, women will always have that power. It's very rare to find that type of organization among men, or for it to happen organically. That's it, I say.
We're very happy to talk more about this tomorrow. Yes. Also, yeah. So I think Professor Bautista is passionate about this topic.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm worried that
Yes, go to your family. And tomorrow we meet in the morning, 9 to 12.
Yes, 9 to 12. Okay, good, thank you.
So we can have a relaxed Friday afternoon. And you read African Place and Assets, right? No?
I did. Okay. We should go.